Thanks for the invitation. Yes, glad to see you all here. This is my sort of first visit to CMI, so it's good to see a lot of students. When he introduced me, he said it's a physics talk, but it's more of stuff that fits in the realm of applied mathematics. So we'll see how mathematics can be used to develop equations, differential equations, and various kinds of similar equations to model fluid dynamics of the oceans. Okay. So I work at ICTS and also at an institution called Center for Applicable Mathematics, which are both situated in Bangalore. So we'll start by looking at this movie, which is showing us the flow in the world's oceans. So this is from a numerical simulation of different partial differential equations that we'll see later in this talk. And this was run at the Jet Propulsion Lab at NASA in the US. And this is a simulation that used about 70,000 processors. So typically, if you look at a laptop, you have a few processors, maybe 4, maybe 8. But this is something that used 70,000 processors to integrate equations of the world's ocean. So when I run this, you'll see we're looking at surface speed here. So you'll see a lot of these fast fluctuations that you see here. These are atmospheric winds blowing over the ocean. So you see this wind-driven motion. And if you look at these parts, you can see jets coming out of these areas. So these are called jet streams. And we have vortices. We'll see what vortices are later in this talk, but these are vortices or eddies we call, spinning out of these jets. And now we are near the coastal area. So here you again see these fast fluctuations. So these fast fluctuations are tides. So all of you have heard of tides. There are lunar and solar tides. So these are tidal motions near the coast. And then again, you see eddies or vortices spinning off different currents. And here again, you can see tidal motion. There's a lot of eddies or vortices spinning off. And you can see these wind motions again. There's a lot of these fine, smaller scale fluctuations. And again, near the coast, you see tides. So these are dominant flow components in the ocean. You see wind-driven waves. You see eddies. And tides. So here again you can see wind forcing is strong here, so that's why we see this breeze and waves getting excited here. So this is typically how the flow in the ocean looks. It's a mixture of these fast fluctuating waves and a lot of these turbulent eddies. And these eddies and waves make up the flow, the turbulent flow in the ocean, and understanding this is important for understanding the climate and weather of our planet. So we'll see that here. So when you look at, yes. Right. Correct. So what we saw was about a year, 1 year. That whole movie is about a year. Yes. They're of the order of a day. So tidal motions, for example, is 12 hours, 24 hours, etc. The eddies are slower. They evolve on time scale of weeks. So we'll see some of these time scales soon. So here are things you learn in because I was told there's a lot of high school students here. So these are things you probably learn in school, right? 3/4 of the planet is covered with oceans, and these oceans, they do a lot coupled with the atmosphere. So the oceans take up a lot of carbon dioxide. So you hear about global warming and so on. So when you have global warming is caused by carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Now this carbon dioxide in the atmosphere can dissolve in the oceans, and that forms a sink for carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So you're removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere by dissolving in the oceans. And this process has its consequences. For example, the oceans become more acidified as a result of that. That affects marine organisms and so on. And so we saw this movie which had a lot of these eddies. So this is an example eddy field. This is a satellite image now. So we're looking at the image that you see is phytoplankton. So the marine organisms, planktons in the oceans, they are responsible for producing a major part of the oxygen in the atmosphere. So the phytoplanktons do a lot, and this is phytoplankton field being stirred by eddies. So when you look through satellite images, you see a lot of these kind of structures. And the eddies that we saw earlier, they carry about 90% of the flow kinetic energy. So understanding these eddies is important because these turbulent eddies transport the flow energy, momentum, and traces across the oceans. And when you look at the dynamics, it's about 1,000 kilometers. So all of you know that the Earth's radius is about 1,000 kilometers, 10 power 6 meters, right? So 1,000 kilometer scale, these eddies and the flow is going across the entire planet, and this water moves around the entire planet. There's like cold water sinking in the polar region, and there's warm water in the equatorial region rising up. So there's a big transport happening of all these tracers and flows, and understanding this is key for understanding the weather and climate of our planet. So this is another movie zoomed in now. So some of the previous questions will take here. By the way, all these the movies that I'm showing is actually, the data set is out there. This was run by originally run by Menendez at this high resolution at JPL NASA, and this is another movie showing us these fast fluctuations on a closer time scale. So this is tidal motion now that is seen near the coast, and this tide, this is a lunar tide, so it has a time scale of 12.5 hours. That's the time scale of this tide. And in the background, you can see these eddies or vortices spinning off. So there's a time scale difference here. These waves or tides are fast, and then we have these eddies that are much slower. So there's a time scale separation, which we'll see this from the mathematical equation soon. So let's get to the equations now. Again, initially I was concerned that, I was told that these are high school students, but then, Kurtush was saying these students are from 11th and 12th, right? Many of you are from 11th and 12th. So you would know Newton's law in differential equation form at all. So this is essentially Newton's second law written for a fluid equation, right? So it's in the form F equal to ma. So this left hand side is the acceleration of the fluid. So you take Newton's second law, divide throughout by the mass. So this is equation per unit mass. On the left hand side, you have acceleration. This is a time derivative. This is something we call convective derivative. Both these constitute acceleration of the fluid, and these are the forces that appear in the fluid. So this is the pressure force, and this is the gravitational force, and this is what we call the viscous force. So these forces balance the acceleration of the fluid, and this is a condition that says that the fluid is incompressible, that the density is not changing. So these equations are popularly called the Navier-Stokes equations. All right. And so here, this is the velocity vector. V is the velocity vector, P is pressure, and nu is what we call kinematic viscosity. And these are the mathematical operators we use. So this equation, this is something you learn if you take a fluid mechanics course at an undergraduate level, you will learn this equation, Navier-Stokes equation. Now, a planet is rotating, right? So because of rotation, if you stand on this planet, and if you are at large scales, you will feel the effect of rotation. So remember, our scale is of the order of meter. We are a few, maybe an order of meter, right? But the fluid motions that we see are order thousands of kilometers or 100 kilometers. So these fluid motions feel the rotation of the planet. And this is again one learns in school or college, right? You can differentiate. So if you are an inertial frame, so what we are trying to do is the equations that I showed you previously are in a non-rotating frame. We are trying to go to a rotating frame. So you show that time derivative of a displacement field, for example, is inertial frame is rotating frame derivative plus this Coriolis force term, right? So we have this, and then this is for displacement. Now when I look at velocity, I have to apply this once more, and I'll get this 2 omega cross v. So this is a Coriolis term that appears in the Navier-Stokes. So this is a new term that appears when you're trying to model fluid dynamics of the atmosphere and the ocean. You have this extra term coming in, the Coriolis force. And so this is written in a coordinate independent form. So this is the picture you should have. We are on a rotating planet, and these motions feel the effect of rotation. So that's a Coriolis term. Now an approximation people make is what is called a tangent plane. So the previous equations were written for the entire sphere. We are assuming the planet is a sphere and we are somewhere. Now if you are interested in modeling the local dynamics in a region, for example, if I am interested in understanding what's happening in the Indian Ocean region, Bay of Bengal, Arabian Sea regions, then I can make what's called a tangent plane approximation, where I would put a tangent plane here, and I can project all the equations onto this plane, and the Coriolis term also gets projected on this plane. So now I'm considering the local vertical or local normal of this plane, and that component, rotation component, is what we call F. So this is also called the F-plane approximation, where we are assuming we are on a plane with the rotation of this tangent plane considered. So that gives us these equations now for the momentum equation. So we have the time derivative term, advective term, Coriolis term, and this term. So now when you look at flows in the atmosphere and the ocean, this applies broadly. A lot of the early stuff that I mentioned will apply broadly to the atmosphere also. So we have this balance called hydrostatic balance. This is again something that you might have learned in school. So hydrostatic balance is just saying that the pressure gradient in the vertical direction balances the gravitational force. That's hydrostatic balance. So this is a balance that you see at large scales in the atmosphere and the ocean. Okay, so this is something that we see from observations of the atmosphere and the ocean. So that's one balance. The other balance, a very important balance condition that we see in the atmosphere and the ocean at large scales, is what is called geostrophic balance. So if you look at the Coriolis term, this F cross V term, and we have the pressure gradient in the horizontal direction. Okay, so these two terms can balance, and that gives us what is called geostrophic balance. So it's saying that at leading order, or to a good approximation, these terms, the time derivative and advective term, has lesser role than the horizontal balance. Now this is again something we see in observation. So if you look at a weather map, so you can Google a weather map, Indian Space Research Organization, all these organizations, they track pressure fields in the atmosphere. And so we are looking at these black curves that you see. These are what are called isobars, so constant pressure lines. So all these lines have same pressure. So when you look at these isobars, the fluid flow in the atmosphere at large scales is along these isobars. Okay, so that's the statement of geostrophic balance. So from this you can show that the velocity. So if you rearrange this balance, you can show that the velocity is orthogonal to the pressure gradient. Now pressure gradient is along the normal to isobars. So this is telling us that the fluid flow is along constant pressure lines. So that's the condition of geostrophic balance. This is again something, these balances, geostrophic balance and hydrostatic balance, are something we see in observations of the atmosphere and the ocean. So we have these two balances. So that's the equation we looked at. Now the other effect we see in the atmosphere and the ocean is density change. So again, this is something you might have seen in school. The atmosphere, for example, has density changing in the vertical direction. As you go up, density decreases. So this is something we call stratification. In the fluid dynamics community, we call it stratification. And if you have a stably stratified fluid, stable stratification would mean that as you go up vertically, density would decrease. So that would mean if you took a fluid element here, and if you pushed it up, this fluid element now is in an environment where the density around it is lower than itself, because we pushed it from here. Okay, so pushing this fluid element from here, so density is higher here, lower here. When I push it here, this fluid element is in an environment where density is lower, so it gets pushed back down. Okay, and similarly, if I take this fluid element and I push it down, now this is in a background where the density is higher than its own density, so it gets pushed up. So it executes a simple harmonic motion. In fact, I think this is a question that used to be asked in the IIT JEE exams long back. Show that if you have a fluid parcel in a troposphere setup, you would execute a simple harmonic motion of this kind. So this is a simple harmonic equation where zeta is our vertical displacement, and this n that appears, so this n is the density change in the vertical direction. So it goes like the vertical derivative of buoyancy, where buoyancy is proportional to density changes. So this is the n, and it's called the buoyancy frequency or the Brun-Weisel frequency. So the equations that we saw earlier, Navier-Stokes equation, we added the Coriolis term, this term, and in addition we have now an extra equation because density is changing. This is the buoyancy equation. So buoyancy is essentially density change. So buoyancy equation with this extra n term comes in. The n is the buoyancy frequency. So that's the extra equation you have to couple with the Navier-Stokes equation to get the governing equations for flows in the atmosphere and the ocean. And so these equations are popularly called the Bus-Sinus equations, where you have equations for velocity, equation for buoyancy, and this is an equation that tells us the fluid has mass conservation. Density is not changing much. So Bus-Sinus is an approximation that is used when you have density changes that are very small. Density is changing, but it's much smaller than, say, in a compressible fluid or shock wave forming or very high speed flows. These are all very low speed flows. So density changes very little. So now some of the important parameters we'll look at in this slide. The first non-dimensional number, it's called Rossby number. So Rossby number is a number that tells us how fast the fluid is rotating. So Rossby number is defined as the velocity. So use the velocity. F is the Coriolis term that we saw earlier. This gives us the rotation rate, and L is the length scale we are looking at. So for example, L can be 1000 kilometers for the largest eddies in the ocean. 1000 or 100 kilometers it can change. Or if you go to smaller scales, so at our scale, for example, L would be a meter. So L can change. You use a velocity that can change. So this is Rossby number. So now if you are in a very strong rotating fluid, this F is the Coriolis term. L becomes very large. So Rossby number becomes very small. So for a fast rotating fluid like the atmosphere and the ocean, Rossby number is a very small parameter. Another non-dimensional number that we'll encounter is what is called the fruit number. So fruit number is defined as, it's similar, velocity divided by, now we have the buoyancy frequency coming in, N, and H is like the vertical height of the fluid. So these are two numbers that tells us how rotation and stratification of the fluid affects the flow. And for the large scale dynamics of the atmosphere and the ocean, we will be in a regime where Rossby number is small because this fluid is fast rotating, and fruit number is also small because the stratification, or N, is very strong. So in a stratified and rotating fluid, we have these conditions at large scales. Yes. So strength of stratification is set by this. So you see here, N is set by the vertical derivative of buoyancy. Okay. So if N is large, your frequency of oscillations and the restoring force is very high. So that's what we call a strongly stratified fluid. And similarly, a fast rotating fluid will have much higher F. Now this slide explains to us why integrating these equations on a computer is very challenging. So these are equations. So in principle, so if you want to model weather forecasters, all of them are integrating these equations. So when we get weather updates, they're looking at these and slightly modified equations with different approximations what they are integrating. So now for weather and climate, if you want to integrate these equations, what are the challenges? So this is people who have some experience with numerical methods, so will appreciate this more. So when you look at the system, the smallest scales in the system is order centimeters. So, we'll see more details of turbulence soon. But in the flows that we saw in those movies, you have scales going from 1000 kilometers. This is the order of radius of the planet. From there, energy goes all the way up to centimeter scale. This is the scale at which viscosity acts, and this kinetic energy of the fluid gets converted to heat. So in thermodynamics, you will learn that this energy conversion happens from kinetic to heat. That happens at this scale, centimeter scale. So if this is what we call a decade. From 1000 kilometer to 100 kilometer is 1 decade. And then 100 kilometer, 10 kilometers, another decade. So if you keep counting, there are 8 decades of spatial scales here, from centimeter to 1000 kilometers, 8 decades. That's a lot of scales. And now when you look at time scales in the system, the fastest, we saw tides in that movie. So now that tide is not the fastest wave. The fastest wave have frequency which is set by N. So let's think of that movie again. The movie had tides that I showed you. The tides have scales of the order of F. 1 over F sets the time scale of the tide. But the fastest wave, typically in the atmosphere and the ocean, N, the stratification is stronger than rotation effect. So N will be about 100 times higher than F. Okay. So that means the fastest wave have a time scale set by 1 over N. And this goes to a few minutes. So the fast time scale in the atmosphere and the ocean is about a few minutes. And the long time scale, this is set by how far you want to integrate the equation. So you can go up to, so if you're interested in weather and weather, you're looking at days, weeks, at most a month. When you talk about ocean weather, people typically integrate up to months. Whereas atmospheric dynamics and weather, it's usually weeks. So now again, if you count from minutes to months, how many decades are involved? We have about 6 decades of time scales as you go from minutes to months. So this is if you're going to weeks or months. Now climate change happens over decades or centuries. We talk about big changes in climate over 100 years. So if you count from say minutes to decade or 100 years, we have 9 decades in time. So now we're trying to resolve, so when you talk about climate modeling, and if you were to integrate these equations across all the important scales you have to resolve, you have to resolve 8 decades of spatial scales and about 6 or 9 decades of temporal scales. And that becomes very challenging. It becomes very challenging when you appreciate that in the present modern day weather forecast, what can we afford? We can typically the weather forecasts that operate now operate with something like this. So again, people who have some experience in numerics will know that these equations that we see, these are partial differential equations. So how do we solve these numerically? What you do is you set up what is called a grid. So you put on latitude and longitude, draw these lines, and in the vertical, so we have only what we call discrete points. So we are solving these equations on discrete points, and these are called grid points. So at each grid point, you can rewrite the equation into some form of a linear equation system. So eventually you end up with some kind of a linear equation system with odd grid points, and then these equations in principle, so velocity for example varies at every point and time. But when you discretize it, I have my solution only at certain grid points. So this grid points, so how many grid points can I afford? I can afford in modern day weather forecast and all, we can go up to 1,000 grid points in latitude and longitude. So latitude and longitude, we can have 1,000. We can have about 200 vertical grid points. So this is what is affordable. And if you go to a university level cluster or computing cluster, or if you look at the Defense Research Development Organization of India, Indian Space Research Organization, all of them have supercomputers that can reasonably do this level of computing. And this is, so if you stretch this, we are looking at 3 decades. You can see this is about 3 decades of scales. We can resolve 3 decades, whereas you have to resolve 8 decades of spatial scales in space, right? So, and then we can run these kind of numerical integration for short time. We can run this for order weeks. So we're completely missing this. We are in no place to resolve 8 decades of spatial scales and 9 decades of time. So this is what makes weather and climate forecast very difficult. From a numerical point of view, we know the equations that you have to integrate, and if you integrate these correctly, we have the solutions, weather and climate. But we don't have the computing capacity to do these things in modern day. Yes. Yeah. So this we can go 10 kilometer in the atmosphere. Yes. Ocean will be 3 to 5 kilometers. So correct. Yes. We'll put, these are called vertical levels. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Correct. F is the rotation frequency of planet. Correct. Yes. 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 Correct. Yeah. So it's not obvious from this formula. So maybe when we go a little further, we'll see this. This is, for example, we'll get to this. This is a frequency spectrum in the ocean. We'll get to this again, but I'll briefly point this out. So this is from observations. What you do is you go to the ocean, put in instruments at different locations in the ocean, and then you can collect a time series for velocity, temperature, etc. And now what you do is you do a Fourier transform of that time series. That will give us a spectrum. So this is a frequency spectrum. And when you look at this frequency spectrum, this is a low frequency part. At the low frequency part, we see this plateau. This is all the eddies that we saw in the first movie. And the high frequency part here, there are different wave components. So this one of them, there are different tides, and these tides are named based on the way the name is. One of it's called O1. This is K1, 2M2. M2 is called the semi-diurnal tide. Okay, and as you see, this is purely observation. This has a time. This is the most dominant component in the high frequency part, and that has a time scale of 12.5 hours. That comes close to the inertial frequency. And this can be shown based on two-body problem by looking at the lunar tide equations. You can derive that. So it can be derived, but that's the dominant tidal component. But there are other tidal components with time scale of 48 hours and so on. So there are different components. Also, there are solar tides which are also featuring somewhere here. So all of these are tides. Yeah, let's see. Correct. Yes. Right. 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 So this is addressing another thing that I didn't mention. The other thing is, if you take these equations, so for example, weather forecast, for example, if you take these equations, these are what are, we solve them in an initial value setup where you put in things like temperature, pressure, etc., and you integrate this forward. So if your initial conditions have errors, which can happen when you measure things, the solutions can diverge. So predicting weather, etc., accurately for a long time has that challenge also, even if you end up with big computers to solve these accurately. So that's a different challenge, which we are not getting into, but that's also a problem. Now, the bypass to things like that is that when you look at the atmosphere and the ocean, these flows are constantly forced by, so for example, the oceans are forced mechanically by winds and tides and all this. And these are, so this is something you can show. In turbulent flows, when you have these forced dissipative setups, you might not get the exact solution, but the statistics of the solution are still pretty good. So we get to predict the mean states of the oceans, climatological states, etc. pretty well, if you know the forcing and sources and sinks of energy well. So we have this, and then, yeah, so now I think I've explained the challenge here. And this is where applied math and a lot of physical assumptions are useful, because we're not in a position, in fact, I don't know if you know, there's something called Moore's law. I don't know how many of you heard of it. Moore's law. Moore's law is a scaling that tells you computing power increases by a certain amount in every decade. Right? With our CPUs improving, now we have GPUs exploding. With a lot of that, you can measure in the next decade or the next century where will we be. So if we calculate based on Moore's law and similar approximations, we will get to resolving all these scales around 2150 or so. So that's the time scale we're looking at, another 100 years or so before we resolve all of these scales with the appropriate challenges we have. So this is very far, right? 100 years from now. So that's where approximations and a lot of these applied math techniques that we'll see will be useful for understanding phenomenology of these flows. So the first approximation that we'll learn in this talk is taking advantage of what we learned earlier, geostrophic balance. So geostrophic balance, as I pointed out, is Coriolis term balancing this pressure gradient. And this is something meteorologists and oceanographers see this regularly. Flows in the atmosphere and the ocean at large scales is parallel to isobars or constant pressure lines. So that's something we know. And now we're going to take advantage of it. Now this is an applied math technique that people call asymptotic analysis. Okay. So asymptotic analysis you might learn in undergraduate or graduate school. We won't go into details, but the idea is that, as mentioned earlier, Rossby number is a small parameter. It's small. Fruit number is also small. So epsilon is this parameter. So you go to the equations and you non-dimensionalize the equation, and then epsilon multiplies all these nonlinear terms. And now by using asymptotic analysis, you can derive a new partial differential equation for just this component, the geostrophic balance component. So keep in mind, the equations that we have contains a lot of motions. It contains a lot of complexity. You can ask, I care only about this particular component, the component of the flow that's in geostrophic balance. So if you do that, you can use asymptotics to derive an equation. This equation is called the quasi-geostrophic equation. So it's called quasi-geostrophic because you are in geostrophic balance, but it's evolving slowly. So that's why the quasi comes in. And this tells us how the balance component, this component alone, this component of the flow, evolves on longer time scales. And so this equation was first derived by a meteorologist called Charney. So Charney derived it in 1948. And this was also derived parallel by a person called Obuko. So Obuko was a student of a person called Kolmogorov. Some of you might have heard of Kolmogorov. So Obuko was a student of Kolmogorov, and he derived this paper is in Russian. So these two people derived it, the QG equation. So because of that, it's also called the Charney-Obuko equation sometimes. And so this equation was a big achievement because people had tried to integrate the equation, the full equations, and to predict weather. This was attempted many times, and it never succeeded because the fluid dynamics of these flows have a lot of fast waves, right? So we saw in the first movie that there are a lot of these fast waves, and tracking those waves requires more computing power. But this equation, the achievement of this equation is that the equation removes all those fast waves. The waves are completely gone, and we have an equation for the balance component alone. So this equation was first integrated with the help of von Neumann. So von Neumann, he had the first computer. It's called the ENIAC. You might have heard this. ENIAC was a computer, and so von Neumann had this computer, and he was looking for problems you could try with this computer. What do we try with this computer? And then Roseby, we saw Roseby number earlier, right? Roseby introduced Charney and his equation to von Neumann, and they collaborated, and they integrated this QG equation with the help of ENIAC, and that led to the first successful weather prediction. So these are the papers that discusses weather prediction by integrating the QG equation. So successful in the sense that we saw these constant pressure surfaces. So if we integrate those equations, you can deduce how these isobars move with time. So that was the achievement of the QG equation time evolution. So this was done, and it was in the 50s. Now we are in a position to integrate the full equations at reasonable resolutions. But back in the day, the QG equation and this applied math technique of asymptotic analysis was useful to get an equation that bypasses all these fast waves, and they could predict weather. So everything that we looked at so far has to do with the balance dynamics. When we had questions about waves, so these are the different waves that appear from the equation. So if you go back to the equations, what you do is, this is again something you do in classes on waves. You can look for plane wave solutions, and so what you do is you take these equations, substitute a Fourier expansion of this form, where k is the wave number, it's the wave number vector, and omega is the frequency. So if you put in this assumption in the equation, you'll get frequencies of these waves in terms of the wave number. So this expression, this is what is called a dispersion relationship. It connects the frequency of waves with the wave number. So that's done here. And so the thing to note, again, because we had multiple questions regarding waves, what you can show with this expression that the frequency of all these waves lies between f, which is corresponding to the Coriolis term, and n, which is due to stratification. So this is the frequency spectrum that I pointed out. Here f is somewhere here. This line marks f. So it's the lowest frequency of waves. And n, the stratification frequency, will be somewhere here. So this band is all the waves that we see in the ocean. And as I pointed out, this is something you see from observation. What you do is you put in instruments in the ocean, collect time series, do a Fourier transform, you get this. And the balance component lives here. So this is the low frequency component. This is the high frequency component. And so in the ocean, there are different kinds of waves. In the first movie that I showed you, we saw wind-driven waves. Those are called inertial waves. This particular peak that you see here are those wind-driven waves. So inertial waves are a dominant component in the oceans. And then we have tidal waves. The prominent one is what is called the M2 tide. This is a prominent one. And then we have all these high frequency waves. So this is a very universal picture in the ocean. And so there are a lot of mathematicians and physicists trying to explain things like the slope. So this slope, for example, is often close to 2. What sets this slope? And so people like me, when we work, we are trying to figure out how energy, for example, gets to all these scales. In the ocean, energy is being put in at this inertial frequency, tidal frequency, and so on. So how does energy fill up this internal wave continuum? This is also called, this part is also called the internal wave continuum, because it looks like a sort of continuum. And also people study how these eddies and waves interact. So that's a problem we'll look at briefly in this talk. So let's look at the different components again. The two components that you see, the prominent components are geostrophic balance flow, or the vertical field or the eddy field. So that's in geostrophic balance, and it lives here. And we have what are called internal gravity waves. And these waves have time scales going from minutes to day. So the minutes would be somewhere here, and order day would be here. So those are all the waves, and they follow these dispersion relationship. Yes, yes. So, well, yeah, so the dominant tides are here, lunar and solar tides. This guy can resonantly interact with itself or other components and produce twice frequency components. So, yes, that's how these 2m2 and all form. And then, yeah, topography causes refraction. That can generate, yes, that's also a mechanism, yes. And then forming these guys, this is something that's still active research. How do this frequency component form, the internal wave continuum? That's something people study. So topography, scattering by eddies, all of that cause that. So yeah, these are the two components. And then, so that's about the components in the ocean. Now we'll look at, this is a very brief, dressed down introduction to turbulence in the oceans. So what is turbulence? Turbulence is, so we saw in the first movie and all, turbulence is essentially a fluid motion which looks chaotic and random. So when you look at the properties, for example, temperature, salinity, etc., you don't see a very clear structure. It's fluctuating with respect to a mean, etc. And its turbulent flows are characterized by many different scales. Again, think of the movie. We saw large scales, spatial scales, small spatial scales, etc. So in the frequency spectrum, again, you see many different scales. And all these scales interact. It's not like, so if you take the system, the ocean system, and if you say, I want to focus on this particular frequency and this particular frequency, we miss a lot of dynamics. Because these guys, as I said in response to the question, these high frequency components which are forced transfer their energy to higher frequencies and so on. Okay, so it's a coupled system that's interacting and chaotic. That's what we call a turbulent flow. So turbulent flow, when you look at turbulent flow, it was Kolmogorov who first came up with this idea. He came up with an idea called cascade. So cascade is, you put in energy. So these figures that you see here, these are like eddies or vortices in the ocean. So you put in energy at large scale, they break into smaller eddies and so on. So it's like a process that goes or resembles water flowing over a staircase sort of thing. So it's called a cascade, meaning energy goes from large scales to smaller scales gradually, step by step. Okay, so that's a turbulent cascade. So when you look at a turbulent cascade, the mechanism by which energy goes from large scales to small scales through this step-by-step process is called a forward energy cascade. So this is very well studied in the fluid dynamics community. People study this a lot, and Kolmogorov was the first to come up with this idea that you can study this, and he came up with mathematical propositions for this. So now we're looking at, this is a movie that shows us this forward cascade process. Here we have a jet. So for example, if you have a blower or something, you have fluid coming out of this that creates these vortices. So you see these vortices being generated here, and they travel downstream and they break. As they go downstream, they develop instabilities, they break, they form smaller scales, and eventually they start disappearing. So if you look at this color bar, it's white or strong here, and as it goes down, it's breaking down and dissipating. So viscosity is acting here to dissipate it. So this is an illustration of this turbulent cascade. Energy starts out at these big vortices, and they gradually break step by step, and it goes to small scales. So this is a turbulent cascade in fluids, and this operates at millimeter scales, very small scales. So these are flows that doesn't have rotation or stratification. These are very small flows. So that's the most studied turbulent cascade. Now we see what is called an inverse cascade. So inverse cascade is, so when you look at flows in two dimensions. So we saw in the talk things like rotation and stratification coming in. So when you have a rotating fluid or a stratified fluid, it affects the three-dimensional nature of the fluid. The flow becomes more two-dimensional. So when you have two-dimensional fluids, so this is an equation. This is called the two-dimensional Euler equation. Or Navier-Stokes, the equation we saw earlier, Navier-Stokes, if you write it for two dimensions, it takes this particular form. So we don't have to bother with specific forms, but the important thing to note is that this equation has two conserved quantities. One is called energy, so this is energy, and the other one is called entropy. Entropy is vorticity squared integrated over the domain. So you have two conserved quantities, and because of that, you can show, again, this is something you can show mathematically, energy in two-dimensional systems goes from small scales to large scales. So this is a movie illustrating that. So it's from a numerical simulation of these equations, two-dimensional Euler equations. So what I have done is, these are this is something we call a random initial condition, where at every grid point I have a random number. So this is a random initial condition, and when I run it, you'll see those random numbers. When I initialize it for this equation system, it forms into bigger vortices that get bigger with time. So this is an illustration of the inverse cascade process, where energy goes from small vortices to bigger and bigger vortices. Okay, so that's an inverse. This is what happens in two-dimensional flows, pure two-dimensional flows. This is again something fluid dynamics and all study a lot. So now in the oceans, earlier we saw this quasi-geostrophic equation. This quasi-geostrophic equation looks very similar to 2D Euler equations. So if you can write it in the same form as what we saw in the previous slide, 2D Euler equations. And this equation again has similar conservation properties, energy and entropy. And because of that, energy goes from small scales to large scales. Okay, so this is a numerical integration of the quasi-geostrophic equation now. And you see these vortices forming and getting bigger. So in the first movie that we saw eddies, a lot of turbulent eddies, right? These turbulent eddies, so in the ocean, for example, typically the diameter of this would be somewhere between 10 to 100 kilometer scale. That would be the diameter of one of these vortices. So these vortices, they don't transfer energy to smaller scales. They remain there or grow bigger. So the question, sort of a conundrum in the oceanographic community is, how do these eddies, how do they lose their energy? Because we have atmospheric winds force eddies also. A lot of energy goes into these eddies. And so the question is, if you're putting energy into these motions, if you have to attain it, when you look at oceans are in equilibrium, which means the total energy going in and the total energy going out is balanced. So how do you equilibrate these eddies? The energy going into these eddies, what is the sink of those eddies? So this is a big conundrum in the physical oceanographic community. And so this is a resolution of the conundrum, right? So this is showing us now. Previous movie that I showed you, this was with eddies alone, the balanced flow alone, geostrophic. It's called quasi-geostrophic turbulence. But now when you have waves in this flow, so we're looking at two flows. On the left, I have a flow that has waves and eddies. So I have both components of similar energy. And on the right, we'll look at a case where I have wave energy much higher than eddy energy. So when you look at this case where you have waves and eddies, the eddies form, they get bigger with time, as we saw in the previous movie. So this is quasi-geostrophic turbulence. It happens even when you have some waves in it. But if you increase the wave energy, so this is now showing you what happens when you have a lot of waves. So when you have a lot of waves, like tides or wind-generated waves, it can break these eddies and it can form smaller and smaller structures that get dissipated. So this is an answer to this conundrum being, once you put in energy into these eddies, how does energy go to smaller scales? How do they dissipate? So that question is answered when you include internal waves and wave dynamics. Right. They are, no, so, okay, well, I don't know what happened. How do I, yes, okay. Maybe let's go here again. So, here, the geostrophic turbulence tells us energy must go up, right? So that's within this model, but in the ocean, when you look at it, this flow is also equilibrated. So what we didn't know is, how does this flow equilibrate? And so that the resolution is, if you have waves in the system, the waves can exchange energy. So that's what is being shown in this slide. This is now a time series of wave and eddy energy. So both these flows can exchange energy, and that can help dissipate these eddies. But there could also be other states in between where other dynamics happen. Yes. 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 The conundrum was with inverse cascade, because these eddies transfer energy upscale. So energy transfer upscale, there's no conundrum, because in this forward cascade scenario, if you put in energy here at large scales, it's getting to small scales and dissipated. So the conundrum is the following. In the ocean, energy is being put in at large scales. How does it get to small scales? That's the question. Yeah, but the forward cascade cannot happen for these eddies. Right? So if you didn't have rotation and stratification, you'll get a forward cascade. But when you add rotation and stratification in a fast rotating, strongly stratified fluid, what you get is an inverse cascade for the eddies. So that's the conundrum. If you put an energy here now, how can it go to smaller scales? And there are different answers to this question. If you are near boundaries, for example, the eddies can interact with boundaries and break. That's another mechanism. But if you're far from boundaries in the deeper parts of the ocean, internal waves can do this. Internal waves can interact with balanced flow. They can exchange energy. The two can exchange energy, and eddies can break due to waves. So that's so this is an area where there's a lot of research going on, because I showed earlier, right, the QG equation and all. In the 1950s and for many years, atmosphere ocean community used to work with the QG equation. And that equation doesn't have waves. But over the past 10-20 years, people are realizing that waves have important dynamics that we have to capture. So now we are pushing to include internal wave effects, etc., into these models. So this, let's see, the units here would be, this is like 2000 inertial periods. So you could think of this as like, this is like 1000 days. So the process is slow when you look at the time scale. All these cascades, etc. So it takes several months for energy to go down. So now we are going to look at how can we parameterize these. So everything that I showed earlier, for example, see this particular simulation. This is something I ran on Los Alamos supercomputers. I don't know if you've heard of Los Alamos lab. Los Alamos lab. Have people heard of Los Alamos lab? Yeah. So that lab, when I was in the US, we had some computing resources there. That's where this was run. And this computational simulation was run for about 4 or 5 months. So that's the time it takes on supercomputers to run these. So these computations are very expensive. So for example, nowadays in India, when we do this, and in the US too, we write research grants to get money to do this research. So when you look at computation like this, to run a research project of this scale over a 2-year period, will need something like 1.5 crore. That's the amount of money that goes in to these computations. So it's a lot of money. This is very expensive. And it's expensive because we are integrating the full equation that I showed you earlier, Boussinesq equations. And now the question is, we know the solution, we know what's happening. Can we build simpler mathematical models that can generate similar flows with similar properties? So that's the question. This is going towards what is called parameterization. So parameterization is, you all know how to parameterize a curve, for example, right? So parameterization is, we don't want to integrate the full equation, but we integrate something simpler with the effects that we don't capture parameterized. So we look at something called stochastic parameterization. So stochastic, so this is something you learn in maybe probably undergraduate studies and all. So maybe in school you learn probability, right? So in probability, so if you have a field, so for example here Q is a field, meaning that it depends on space and it evolves in time. So if I make Q a random variable, at every grid point if I have a random variable, and if I use the laws of probability to evolve it in time, that becomes a stochastic field. So now we are going to look at some stochastic models that can mimic similar flow structures that we saw earlier. So this equation, we saw the Cauchy-Joseph equation earlier in this talk. You can do similar asymptotics and derive an equation that includes the effects of waves. So this is written out here. So when you have internal waves in your system, so for example, if you want to capture these kind of effects, the equation you should have is written here. So here red and blue terms are the terms that are coming in because of waves. So red terms especially are due to waves. So what we're going to do is, we're going to include these terms. So I'm taking the Cauchy-Joseph equation. So the first term and this term is same term that you get from QG. So this Q is also in the QG equation. I'm adding a stochastic term or a random field that changes with time with certain properties. So that's this term. And there's something called data-driven equation discovery. So when you have a lot of data, you can use this data and you can construct equations that behaves according to those data sets. So that is done to discover this term. Q square term. So this is a simpler model that is built on QG equation, but that can bring in the effects of internal waves. So this is work that was led by a student who worked with me, Kridin Gauthaman, and I'll show you some interesting results from this. So here, these are the solutions. So earlier we saw some 3D solutions. These are slices of the solutions. So this is from Boussinesq equation. The full equations were integrated to get these solutions. So this is in a particular configuration, this in a different configuration, and this is a third different configuration. And the equation that I showed you earlier, this particular model, we're calling it stochastic QG. This equation has maybe let's look at that equation once more. So this equation has two important parameters. One is called the energy ratio parameter. This parameter tells us how strong this stochastic term is compared to energy of the system. So that's one parameter. And then the second parameter in the system is the epsilon that goes in here. This is a term that sets the strength of this Q square term. Okay. So why do we need this Q square? This Q square will come in because when you look at flows in the ocean, so let's look at this particular flow, for example, you can see red vortices are stronger and coherent compared to blue vortices. So to bring in that effect, we introduce that Q square term. So it's a data-driven equation discovery procedure that gives us that term. So these are complex flows that are generated with crores of money going to supercomputers. The model that I showed you earlier can produce similar looking flows on a laptop. The equation that I showed you earlier on the stochastic QG, this you can integrate on a laptop with very little computational resources, and it can produce very similar flows with very similar properties. So in this paper led by the student, we have a lot of comparisons going between these different models. So that's an achievement it's an applied math achievement where you can construct this simpler model that parameterizes complex effects without having to spend so much on computing resources. Yes. Correct. Yes. Yeah, this is not a neural net kind of setup. We'll get to a neural net setup, but this is not a neural net setup where we are learning using that standard procedure. What we do is, the way these things work, you have a base of terms that can generate dynamics, and then you integrate these models with these different parameterization, and you're comparing the statistics with the full data. So correct. Correct. Yes. Although it's not done in that kind of an algorithmic format, because the basis sets we have are discovered with the data. Correct. Yes. Yeah, you could, that can happen. So you have to, it's like, you have to look for this curve where it dips, reaches a minimum, and then it doesn't rise again. So it can happen. You could be in this region where it is rising again, which means the errors. Once you see that the errors are increasing, yes. So you can, that's how it's also possible that, so this is one model. We're actually working on this a lot with different people. You can have different models that can produce similar results. So there's no, when you have partial differential equation that I showed you earlier,